Okay, so good morning. I would like to call the meeting of the Finance Committee of the Town Council to order and this is May 31st, and it's 2 minutes after 9. So I want to thank everybody for being present, and I will first start by making the usual announcement that pursuant to Chapter 20 of the Acts of 2021, extended by Chapter 22 of the Acts of 2022, this meeting will be conducted via remote means. Members of the public who wish to access the meeting may do so via Zoom or by telephone. No in-person attendance of members of the public is being permitted, but every effort is being made to ensure that the public can adequately access the proceedings in real time via technological means. So with that, what I would like to do is the next step is, just a second, because I've lost the meeting. Okay, thank you. What I would like to do is call on each member of the Finance Committee to assure that they can hear me and we can hear them. And then I'm going to turn it over to Lynn as Council President, because I think that she has to convene a meeting of the council, since there's a quorum of the council present at the moment. So with that said, again, going alphabetically by last name, Lynn?
Present.
Bob?
Present.
Matt?
Morning, present.
Bernie?
Present.
Michelle?
Here.
Kathy?
Here.
And Alicia?
Here.
Okay, great. So we have all members of the committee are present, and it's duly noted. Lynn?
I'm calling the town council together for its for its committee of the whole meeting with the finance committee at 9:05. And I'm going to check and make sure that Jennifer Taub, you can hear me and I can hear you.
Yes, I can. Thank you.
And Pat DeAngelis.
Yes, I'm here and I can hear.
Thank you both.
Okay, so let me do a quick agenda review, and I can put it on the screen, or somebody can put it on the screen if they wish, but in any event, we've done the call to order, and now the agenda review. I'm going to do public comment early in the meeting because, as I had said previously to the committee, that since we are going to be making decisions today, I thought it was more important that we have public comment earlier rather than wait for later in the meeting, because it would be very important for us to be able to hear from the public in a timely manner, so that we can consider their views during our discussion. We will see if there are any additional questions or discussion about the budget, and I will comment on that a little bit further in a moment, and then do the budget review and planning for next meetings. For members of the committee, I wanted to explain a little bit more about the process and for the public, for the members of the about the process for today, which is different because we're now at the point where we need to make some recommendations for the council. As I have pointed out in several things, including a memo to the council itself, the charter requires that the finance committee make a recommendation on the budget within 30 days of referral. Referral is on May 2nd. Tomorrow is the 30th day. So this is the day we have to make the decision, and I have to then send a memo, and we're going to do the report in two parts this time. The report that's going to go first to the council will be a very brief report, just stating what recommendations we're making, but not have a discussion of the recommendations, which will then give us more time to actually have a further discussion, or further process to really develop the discussion in a more thoughtful way. So by splitting it, we've achieved the goal that's required by the charter, and we will have a fuller explanation and a more thoughtfully written explanation available for the council and the community when it looks at what our work has been. We had an agreement that if any two members of the committee identified issues that includes today, that they would be included in the discussion, that after we discuss budget and all of the issues that are identified, we will then see if there's a motion on the budget itself. And I also want to remind you that the capital improvement program will be done in a separate process on a separate timeline as provided in the charter. So the other thing that we did was in the last meeting, we identified two issues for discussion today. One was the school funding request made by the school committee. And so that is going to be one item that we will have some significant discussion on. We have heard significant public comment about the public safety budget. And given that, we had agreed that we would talk about the public safety budget because it would be important to be able to have that discussion and to be able to reflect it in the memorandum as a matter of fully informing the community and the council about our discussion of these issues and our analysis. And the third thing that I wanted to add is that as I was beginning to work on the sort of the outlines, the very beginning of the report, I became concerned about questions of long-term planning and whether we are thinking through not just FY23, but the parts of the budget that are presented to us that are not the FY23 budget, but are FY24 and beyond, and whether that both affects our thinking in general on financial planning for the community and the town, but also whether it affects our thinking about the budget that we're going to be voting on today, which is the FY23 budget. I did talk with this over with the vice chair, who's Kathy, and she agreed that this is an important issue. And therefore, since there were two of us who identified the issue, I went ahead and added it to the list without having a further process, because that meant that there were two of us who had identified the issue. I tried to frame it in a series of questions that I sent to Paul and to Sean, and Paul and Sean responded, and those responses, I only sent this yesterday, and I only got the responses last night and this morning. So they are now been forwarded to the committee, and because there are others who are interested, I asked Athena to add them to the packet for the meeting, the questions and the responses that we received. So that is the third issue. So with that, I'm going to pause and see if there are any initial comments or questions from members of the committee about the process and or about issues that you would want to make sure are discussed. And after that, I will turn to public comment. Lynn, see your hand is up.
I want to recognize that Dorothy Pam has joined us. Dorothy, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Thank you. And Andy, the list also includes responding to the AHRA request.
We actually, I think we're not, I mean, let's discuss that. I guess that we can discuss that today. And we have to decide to what extent it is an FY23 budget issue or is an issue for a later date. In any event, I do want to acknowledge that we were asked by the council to consider the issue, and if we end up deciding that we're only going to look at the FY23 piece to it, that there are other parts to the reparations discussion, and in order to address that, we will include it in our next agenda, and we will just identify the date for that meeting as noted later this morning. But thank you for bringing that forward. Is there anything else in the way of questions or comments at this point? So hearing none, what I'm going to do is see if there are any members of the public who wish to make public comment. This is a standard process, and if I see any hands raised, I will have that person brought into the room, and will offer the public comment as in a consistent manner with policy. Okay, seeing no public comment at this time, we may come back to one more round of public comment later, but I appreciate that we were given the opportunity to do that soon. So are there other issues right now that any members of the committee or the council think we need to have a discussion on other than the ones that have already been identified? Again, looking for hands and seeing none. So I think that I would propose that we go to the, as a first item, the school committee request. And I don't know if anyone has any introductory comments to make about that, but I hope that what we will do in the course of the conversation is really help identify for the committee and all of the issues on both sides of the matter. So, Lynn.
I just was going to ask Andy whether you want to frame the question before the Finance Committee and the council. I mean, I'll be glad to do it, but if you want to do it, please do.
I think that it's a fairly straightforward question that there's we are limited as a committee and as a council to considering the budget, and we cannot add to the budget for the most part. We can only delete or reduce items within the budget. The one exception is if there is a request from the school committee for additional resources. The state statute and the charter provide that by a 2/3 vote, the council can reverse, add money to the budget for the purpose and amount requested by the school committee. And so, and what I think this basically is, the school committee has spoken on it before by memorandum, but it has tried to frame the budget within the amount that was voted in the guidelines and was provided, therefore, in the guidance to the town manager. The process that took place at the school committee left out funding for one specific purpose. And of course, that was, and to be more specific, the superintendent did not make a recommendation to add time for positions for art and technology teachers that had been reduced from full-time to 80% in the FY22 budget. And it was not within the priorities, apparently, of the superintendent to within the amount of money that was available. The school committee felt that it was important to do that, identified a series of sources of funding, one of which was to ask the council vote an additional approximately $54,000 in funding for FY23 for the school budget for a portion of the cost. I think that there are a series of issues that we will want to talk about as a committee and as a council. And I can frame a little bit of that, but I'm hoping that the discussion will do so. Matt, I see your hands up.
Thanks, Andy. I don't usually jump right in terms of first comment, but I thought since I spent quite a bit of time chatting with school committee chair and finance director, I would just weigh in again on my thoughts on this. And, you know, as I said before, for me, the 54,000 is in the general ebb and flow of a large school district budget, relatively large school district budget. 54,000 is a sum that was a surprisingly small amount to be controversial in any way. And I did speak with Doug Slaughter at length, and he was really helpful in terms of providing me some descriptions and context around the numbers. But it became clear to me, just, you know, a school district budget, because there are so many positions in a school district budget that from week to week are unfilled, or, you know, kind of legacy positions. I got the sense from Doug that, you know, that these 54,000 to support these really important high profile positions within the school department, that 54,000 could be found within the operating budget that was proposed in the guidelines originally. And so, you know, although I think the schools definitely face real challenges, that number doesn't, to me, indicate a large structural problem. You know, instead, I think it kind of operates, it's an operating budget number that I think can be solved within the school department. And I also just want to kind of highlight what has been said by many other people, that, you know, the ongoing challenge between the manager's office, the council, and the schools is going to be to rally public support for an override for a very substantial school project in the very near future. And so I don't feel that this is a topic that we want to, it would be better to present a unified front with the manager's office right now than it would be to sort of override that decision on a $54,000 question, which isn't that the name of a game show? It's $54,000 question. It's kind of funny. But anyways, I just want to make those comments. And, you know, I mean, I have utmost respect for Doug and the superintendent and that whole team. However, I don't personally think this is an area that we should overrule the town manager's recommendation.
Thank you, Matt. Lynn?
I'm going to build on what Matt is saying. And I'm going to start by saying, first of all, with all due respect to the superintendent, the school committee, to Doug Slaughter. We gave them guidelines and they came back with something above the guidelines. That sets a precedent that in the years of the council, which are short, we have not seen. And if we start doing it now, there is no end. And so I am not supporting adding the money into the school budget. I also agree with Matt that it can be found elsewhere. And at some time in the future, we may, and I do say may, want to reconsider giving them more money if needed. But because of many other constraints on this budget, I do not see supporting this at this time.
Andy, can I just clarify one thing real
Yes.
quick? Just to clarify what Lynn said. So the superintendent and the finance director did present a budget within the
That's right.
council's guidelines. The school committee, after that presentation, decided to increase it. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Sean.
Yep, no problem.
Yes. I do see that there's a hand up from another member of the council. We're sort of in a very peculiar situation that we are now into committee deliberations. I will recognize all counselors, however, but I'm not going to follow my usual practice of order. So please leave your hand up. That I am moving around and hearing from members of the committee is because ultimately this is a committee decision, but I will recognize other members of the council. Kathy?
Thank you, Andy. I just want to build on what both Matt and Lynn said. I also listened or read the proceedings after the fact. I wasn't there in real time. At the school committee discussion, there was a discussion that there are some internal funds that could make up this 55,000. So it goes with what Doug said, that, and it was pointed out by at least one member. And I think we're in really tight budget worlds with the ESSER funds creating a buffer, but going over the amount right now doesn't make sense to me with what I see, that there is room in the budget that they have now. If this is a high priority and the school committee says, let's go from 80 to 100%, they could find the money. So I'm not making a judgment on these positions. And I just think that we need to stay within the guidelines, because when we get to the later discussion about the rest of the budget, I feel like we are barely making FY23 work. FY24, I want to understand better, and then the next several years. And the point about the school building coming down the road, I think we need to show that we have discipline, the school committee has discipline, and we're making hard choices. But in this case, I don't even feel it's a hard choice, because I think there's enough room in the existing budget that they will have, that there is some latitude. And Matt did a lot more conversations with this, but on some funds that they know they come in under each time, and they know where those monies are. So that's my point of view on this.
Bob?
Yeah, I just want to agree with the other members of the committee that I support the idea of fully funding art and math and tech teachers, but I do think that the superintendent can find the funds within the manager's budget, town manager's budget. I don't see that. I mean, my experience from the private sector is if you can't find $50,000 in a $25 million budget, then you're not really managing well. So I think the money is there if the priority of the school committee is such that they want to fund these positions fully. Thanks.
Okay, Michelle.
Sorry, excuse me. So from my perspective, and I'm fairly new to this, it seems to me like there's an elephant in the room that's not being addressed. And to me, that elephant is a sort of power struggle that we're not really talking about. And I heard Allison speak to coming out of a pandemic. And I agree that $50,000 is not, it does not feel either like a meaningful enough amount to, be addressing. It also doesn't feel like an amount that couldn't be found potentially in the budget. But I think the request to me has more symbolism than anything. And I would like that to be discussed and not just dismissed, because I heard Sean say several times throughout our process here, looking at the budget, that certain departments have received extra funding because we're coming out of a pandemic. And I think that's fair. And I think that's what they're saying too, is like, hey, throw us a bone, like we're coming out of a pandemic. We are responsible. This isn't going to set a precedent. I haven't made a decision on this. I'm just putting this out there. I'm very torn on this. But I just want to address that I don't think this is about the money. And I'm wondering if we have a way that we can address that underlying, in my opinion, issue that is actually manifesting this request.
Bernie?
Yeah, I want to thank Matt for his diligence and the research he's done, and I, will end up supporting the manager's budget. From my perspective, there's always been a great degree of collaboration between the school committee and the select board and the manager, or the regional group. I'm used to real contests in other towns that I've been involved in. So $54,000 doesn't seem like a lot of money, but I firmly believe that it can be found in the budget. I also know that budgets are not written in stone, that at some point in time, we may need to make adjustments. I trust the management of the schools that they will make every effort to find the shortfall and make it up within their budget. And that if they absolutely can't, I trust that they will, in honesty, come to the manager and the council and say, hey, we need to end our budget. So, right now, I do agree with Michelle, it's sort of a test. But my response to it is that, you had a target, your administrators hit the target. Let's move forward. Thank you.
Okay. I'm going to stay with the committee a little bit longer, and then I am going to go to other members of the council who have comments to offer to the committee before we go for get to an end. Lynn?
Yeah, 2 points. Very quickly, I want to clarify. It is not that I do not support the art and technology or any other efforts to bring kids out of the pandemic. That's not the issue. Yes, Michelle, there is an elephant in the room. The elephant in the room is that the town council adopts budget guidelines after discussion starting in November and in December. The budget coordinating group, which I was a member, Andy and Kathy, I think, was a member. The school was never happy, and they started not being happy because we decided in the initial look at the budget to take money from reserves for the CREST program. And their initial comment was that the CREST program had nothing to do with the schools. And that is just wrong. It has everything to do with the schools. And in fact, one of the things that Earl has made a strong effort at is reaching out to the schools and working with the schools. And if we want to write off an entire generation of 18-year and under kids because, quote, CREST doesn't apply to them, then we need to learn what CREST is about and what our future is about. For me, these are the guidelines. and this is where we are. If they want to have a battle, fine. I'm ready.
And Kathy?
Well, I think Michelle's comment was helpful because I think there's a way of framing this, that we are in fact doing a lot of support for the schools. So it's what Lynn just said about Cress, but there's a huge amount of ARPA money that we're helping the elementary school kids, the 6th grade plan. We're dedicated. Sean probably has all these numbers memorized, Sean, but the amount that we've got penciled for ARPA is $800,000 of our ARPA money is going to make it possible for the 6th grade to move up so that we can accommodate an elementary school of K through 5. So I think there's a way of framing how much of our total budget is schools and how much the elementary school budget is compared to everything else in our budget. It's about equal to the town service line. So it's not if anything, I think the town has been bending over backward for decades, but particularly during COVID, to maintain and support our school systems. And it's reflective in these other parts of the budget too. I mean, it was pretty telling when we had the conversation with Cress, where we don't have a full workforce yet, but the first place our director was in the school system and working hard with them. So I think that's going to be a resource that is not in their budget line, but it's in the town budget line that will directly accrue to them, where they've done a very good job, rightfully, of not drawing on the police force. So other towns have police dedicated to different schools, as we've seen, not too successfully in Texas, but we're going in other routes. So I think we should make a strong statement of support for the schools, support for art and technology, and a belief that there is funding within the budget guidelines to do the right thing with these positions.
Okay. Michelle, is it okay if I ask Dorothy to comment?
Absolutely.
Okay, Dorothy. Thank you for your patience, and Dorothy.
Okay. When Michelle talked about the elephant in the room, I thought she was going to refer to dead and traumatized children. I understand the technical discussion, but I think that we also have to realize we're not just bureaucrats, but we're also leaders. We have to be concerned with public perception. And all that we hear about now is about scared children, traumatized. And we know that 5 days of art and tech are part of a healing curriculum. We know that the arts and technology where children can make things, put their own emotions, and come up with new ideas are things that are healing. I understand that the budget game, you can take it from here and move it from there, and that maybe it'll all turn out. But I think that we need a strong statement that we are understanding, we're with the children, we want to do, we want to support them, and if you want to have really good teachers, you pay them 5 days a week, okay? Instead of these kind of crazy mixed up schedules. So you can be right. I mean, of course, I follow your discussion. I understand it. I was on the finance committee. You can be right, but you can be wrong. So I don't think that we have to think of this as a power thing where if you let them have this, then they're going to think they can get away with everything. I think we're at a special moment, and we've had discussions on this, and that you can frame it with the understanding of what you believe. But I think that the budget should include 5-day funding for art and technology at this time.
It's not the question. That's not the question.
I think that Dorothy has the floor now, and then Michelle has the floor, so you need to keep it in order. Michelle, I think Dorothy's not taking her hand down, so it's to you.
Dorothy, are you okay? I just want to acknowledge that in this case, the charter does allow for us to make a change. So when we are talking about, we've given them guidelines and they've gone over the guidelines, I'm not sure why the charter has this allowance in there, if that's the perspective that we're going to take with this. And maybe that's not something that we can solve, but I'm just a little bit confused about the sort of cross narratives there, or the guideline that allows us to make a change, and then the narrative that, we've given them guidelines and they need to accept those guidelines. I want to respectfully disagree with Lynn. I do not want a fight. I do not think we need a fight. I do not think that a fight is helpful or appropriate at this time, especially as we're trying to get the community to band around this new school project. And one of the things that I hope to bring to the council is sort of an awareness of maybe some of the underlying kind of sense in the community. And I feel like these sort of comments about if they want to fight, and again, I respectfully am disagreeing here with Lynn to say that those comments are harmful, and they get out and they get into the media, and then we're in a divisive circumstance within our community. And so I really want to support what Kathy said in the sense that I feel like we should be thinking about framing this and how we can show strong support. We can bring together some numbers to really demonstrate what we are doing to support the schools, and also make it really clear that we see that they're asking us for help as they come out of the pandemic and have children that are struggling and traumatized and all of these things, and that we acknowledge and we see that, and we're fully with them. And yet we still think there's other ways in the budget that they can find this money. And so I don't know what sorts of reports go out, but I would like to make sure that the reporting really makes a strong statement about that. And so that's my thoughts on that. Thank you.
Lynn?
Andy, I just want to ask a piece of history, because you were one of the people who followed the Charter Commission, and that is the issue of the schools being allowed under the new charter to be increased also was true under the previous charter.
This,
Andy, I don't know. Is it in the charter or is it Mass
it's
General
state
law?
law. It's state
No,
law.
It's
it's
Mass General.
actually, it's provided in state law, as you indicate.
Okay.
And the charter, I'd have to get the exact language. I don't have the charter right in front of me at the moment, but it essentially says that the council can make whatever, take whatever action is consistent with state law, I think, essentially. And therefore, because of that provision and state law, even though it's not specifically stated in the charter in effect has adopted it because state statute has it in there, but it was never just specifically considered. Lynn, does that answer the question? And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to call on other members of the committee. I do have some thoughts on it myself. I've been holding back on it, and I'm going to continue to do so for a little bit longer. Bernie, and then Alicia.
Yeah, thank you, Andy. The school committee is authorized to spend their budget for any lawful purposes. They don't have to follow line by line by line what's in the budget. I again feel comfortable that in that a budget that size, you can make up $54,000 over the course of the year. And we'll again repeat that these are not carved in stone, that budgets get amended over the course of the fiscal year. So there's an opportunity later in the year when we have a firm grasp on what we have for revenues to make changes if they're necessary. And I, right at this point in time, do not believe they're necessary. I appreciate the advocacy that are shown by some folks. I've got two grandkids now and 3 in the fall who will be in the school system. So I've got skin in the game, literally. I feel they're well served, and I don't feel the need right at this point to put the additional money in the school budget. And we don't have to make a contest out of it. We can say, let's wait and see. You guys do the best you can to manage We'll do the best we can to manage. We'll watch very carefully how the funds unfold. We'll know much more in October. And then if we need to revisit it, we can revisit it. And it is every budget's a special circumstance. COVID has added a twist to it. And for the record, I'm not happy that we're using money out of the reserves to start a program, but it appears to be necessary. But I reject the special purpose. This is a special situation argument, and I do think, as Kathy suggested, that if we had a comprehensive overview of all the funds that go into the school budget, that would add, people would be able to see exactly what's contributed. But the advocacy is there. It's, people are very well organized. I understand that, but I'm sticking with the manager's recommendation.
Andy, can I just ask for a quick clarification?
Yes.
Because I think it was said twice. Bernie, were you referring to the CREST program when you talked about reserves to start it?
Yeah.
Just to clarify, so the extra 300,000 that was added to the municipal operating budget, that did not come from reserves. That came from the budget process and balancing our revenues and expenses and determining that the town would need those funds to fully implement the 10-person CREST department. If we didn't do that, those funds would have been available for other purposes within the larger budget. But those did not come from reserves. The only use of reserves in this year's in this budget proposal is for the building project, for the Jones Library building project. You'll see there's 500,000 proposed, which is consistent with the plan.
Thanks, Sean. My apology for the.
No, it's okay. I think Lynn may have mentioned it before too, so I just wanted to clarify.
Thanks.
Okay, Alicia?
Thank you. So I'm slightly conflicted by this conversation, and partly because I'm trying to understand, and I know we haven't come to a full consensus as a committee yet, but theoretically, I'm trying to understand our position on this and whether or not we are saying that we don't believe we have the money in our budget to do so, or we believe that they already have the money in their budget and they're not managing it properly, and so that they can find it. So I'm trying to understand what the argument is in terms of the no here, and I'm a little bit confused.
Actually, I thank you for that comment, because I sort of share that concern, because I don't, I find this whole thing's rather peculiar, and this is sort of one of the pieces of my comment too, is that I've been conflicted by it also. The superintendent made a choice in the budget that he presented, and he chose not to include these portions of several positions. Then it went to the school committee, and the school committee had the authority to say, we don't appreciate that budget. We'd like you to solve that budget within the amount of money that has been provided within the guidelines. Instead, they chose to come to the council and say, please add more money, so that, which was sort of a decision that they made. Why did they make that decision, as opposed to taking the point of view that they could have otherwise done, which is the one that I described. So there are a whole lot of things that I just don't understand in the budget. There were one thing that I wanted to put out there, just because I want to be able to include it in comments, and that is whatever we decide, for that matter. One of the arguments was made is that there was additional money that was voted by the legislature along the path of the legislative process for Chapter 70, which is the school aid. And I don't agree with that as being a valid reason at all, because we are so much above the amount that we receive in Chapter 70 that is going to the schools, and we are so much above the minimum contribution requirement for communities to support their schools, that to essentially say, well, this money was voted by the legislature and therefore it has to be spent. It's a form of earmarking, and I am totally uncomfortable at any time with the discussion of earmarking of funds, and so that piece of it makes me uncomfortable. The last thing that I've been struggling with as I've thought about this that hasn't been mentioned is that I always look at budgets over long term, not just for the year we're voting the budget, but future years. And so then you get into the question, okay, if we added money for the positions for next year, is the amount, what is the amount that we're going to be voting for the next year? Is this a decision that we're going to be expected to make for future years? What are the plans then, if these are positions to be continued, to continue the positions? And I just don't see where that fits in. So that's the other piece that has made me uncomfortable. Sean?
Yeah, I just want to add two little things. So one thing I think the school committee set as an early parameter that the superintendent discussed was they didn't want to see any cuts to level services in this year's budget. And I hear everybody saying, you can find $50,000 in a $25 million budget. I don't disagree with that, but I think it's one thing to find it, once the year starts and you realize where savings are, where you see areas that are starting to come in under. It's another thing to actually budget positions and to identify that up front before the year starts. That goes, for the schools, it goes for the town too. It's not as simple to budget for those positions as it is to find that money at the end of the year. And I think the second thing I'll say is, both the town and the schools have considerable uncertainty for next year's budget, which, is one reason I could see the superintendent and the finance director being cautious, is that, we're in contract negotiations, and I don't want to dive deeper, because we are in negotiations, but because contracts are not settled for next year, that causes more uncertainty than in a year where we know what those what compensation levels will be.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. So we do need to get to a conclusion, and I don't see any further hand. Lynn?
Sean, maybe you can remember this. Were these positions in technology and art funded at the 80% level or at full time during FY22? Not that it makes a difference. I'm just curious as to what level services were considered to be.
I don't know the answer for sure, but my understanding is these are additions, that these would be adds to level services, not continuing level services. So that would make me think that they were 80% in FY22, but I can try to find out the answer.
The other thing is, I just want to clarify, I have no problem if the school district wants to fund these positions. That's not where I'm coming from at all. I'm coming from, we all have budget guidelines and we all need to live with them. That's all.
Michelle?
I want to clarify so I make sure I understand. So the process that happened is the school superintendent put out the budget and removed the art and technology. And then the school committee, instead of going back to the superintendent and saying, we need you to find a way to include these things, asked the council to make up for that gap. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And so
Can I just add? So I don't know for sure that that's 100%. I think they may have gone back to the superintendent, and the superintendent, again, I can try to confirm this. I think they may have come back and said, this is what we would have to reduce in order to add those positions back in. So I do think there was a little bit more of a back and forth between the school staff and the school committee.
And thank you for saying that, Sean, because what I'm trying to understand or think about here is, in what circumstances, in your experience, maybe Sean and Andy and those of you who have been doing this for longer, would that happen, that they would come and ask us and not work it out with the superintendent, over this $50,000, like in what circumstances did they have to come to the council to ask for that money and not be able to work it through internally with the superintendent? Like, is there something I'm missing?
So it's never happened since I've been here where there's been the closest example that's happened to this is when there was the library paras were proposed to be reduced, I don't know, 2015 or 2014, and there was a motion made from the floor of town meeting to restore them, and the town meeting restored them. But under this form of government, I don't think it has happened yet.
I think that's correct.
Yeah, I guess I'm that piece is making this decision difficult for me, because I don't think I fully understand what happened in all of those steps, and like the coordinating group and what I mean, it's my understanding that during the budget coordinating meeting, there was one meeting, there was a conversation about this in that meeting, that they were going to need more money. And so there weren't additional conversations that occurred. And so now we're at this place,
There was nothing that came up in the budget coordinating group about the question of these positions specifically. The discussion in the budget coordinating group, it was actually very brief in the end, because the school committee had expressed a concern that the town was being allowed to have a higher percentage of growth between FY22 and FY23 than the schools or the library, and that it was sort of like, this is generally not fair. We should be given an equal amount of increase as the others. And the reason for that differential, as was identified, was in order to enable us to create the CREST program, that that recommendation was made. So that's what the I think happened. I think the other thing that I'll want to note, and then I see Lynn's hand is up, is that I do believe that the positions are part-time in FY22, and that therefore what essentially is that they're asking for not this money not to level fund, but to add back positions. And the reason I say that is, if you go back into the public comment that we received, including some comments from the teachers who were affected by this, they talked about the difficulty of having sufficient time to do what they thought was needed for the kids with within the reduced time. And just that statement having been made, I have to assume that that's what we would find out if we delved into the details of the budget. I'm fairly confident of that.
And Mike, I did check with Mike. He confirmed that they are 80%, Art and Tech are 80% this year.
Okay, thank you. Lynn?
So just filling in a little more. So we start in November with the financial indicators. We move to the financial guidelines, and then everybody goes to, the town does its budget development, the school does its budget development, and the library does its budget development. Okay. And then they all come together. And the only thing we all know is that the regional schools are taken out and done before because of all the reasons we discussed. So what the superintendent did was basically propose a budget with level services. What the school committee did was say, we want more than level services. And for all the reasons that they're arguing, these should be full-time positions. It gives teachers the amount of prep that they need, which I think is what's gotten cut, is the prep. And having been a school teacher, believe me, prep was important. But then the dialogue back and forth between the school committee and the superintendent is already been recounted. We assume that took place. The other missing piece would be is if we were going to give the schools more money, is this what the superintendent would suggest to be used for? And he didn't ask for more money. He came in to the school committee with a budget that was in the guidelines. And, that was after lots of debate with the school committee. So I also want to make sure that we don't cross the line of trying to tell the school how to spend their money. They are a good committee. We have an outstanding superintendent and staff. They need to make the decisions about what's best for the school. So that just fills in a few of the pieces, Michelle, that you were asking about.
Okay. Dorothy, one last time, and then I need to get it to the committee, and because we need to see if we can get to a resolution. Dorothy?
The school committee represents the parents, students, and the town. I think they have a voice, and they're trying to use their voice for something they think is important for children and parents. And I'm just saying, in the context of Amherst talking about its wonderful school system, if you want to have that reputation, you have to live up to that reputation. I was at Grandparents' Day at Bement on Friday, and the head of school said, at Bement, we have arts and music, technology 5 days a week. And he said it unprompted. There was no discussion going on, as if this was self-evident to everybody that it was very important to do that and that they were doing that. And Amherst, with its wonderful school system and the creativity of its students, I just can't see why we're having this symbolic argument. I understand it's about whose role is this, that, and the other, but there's no real downside as far as I see. I don't think you're empowering an out of control school committee. I really don't. And I think it would be a strong statement, and that it would be good for the children of Amherst. And it would be good for the town of Amherst to feel, yes, our school is doing this. That's it.
Okay, well, thank you, Dorothy. So we now need to recognize, of course, that this committee will choose to make a recommendation or decide to leave it in some fashion open, but we do need to get a motion so that we can move forward with this discussion with the motion before us. So I'm hoping that a member of the committee comes forward with a motion, and I will say that all members of the committee, resident members, are welcome to suggest motions. We're into this peculiar process of how to deal with it, but if a member of the resident member of the committee wishes to suggest a motion, I invite that, and then if somebody makes the motion that is suggested, it's on the and it's seconded, it's on the floor. So I'm recognizing all members of the committee, but I think we do need to move forward so that we can get on to the two other identified issues. Okay, Kathy?
I think Lynn was waiting for someone other than herself to raise their hand, since she usually makes the motion. I'm not good at this, so make sure you wordsmith me. I move that we recommend to the town council that we support the town manager's budget for the elementary school system.
Is there a second to the motion?
A second, but a slightly friendly amendment. I move that we recommend to the town council that we adopt the town manager's recommended FY23 budget.
I totally accept that.
I second.
Um, I need to get clarification of that as worded. It's the all-encompassing motion we were looking for. In the end, it is not specifically about the schools. If you want that to be the motion, it is the motion.
It's the one that the town manager recommended included the budget as proposed by the school superintendent, and did not include the additional 54.
My point is that we were going to at least have a discussion about public safety budget before we got to an all-encompassing motion.
Then why don't we hold off on voting on the motion?
Okay.
Okay.
So
So you're thinking, Lynn and Andy, that we don't need a separate one saying specific for the school. We just go for unless there's some other issue with the budget, we're recommending support of the budget as presented is what's being suggested. Okay.
yeah, and I think that what would then happen is that when we get to the longer report, that we will definitely include a significant discussion of the description of our discussion about this particular issue, and indicate so that it's clear that it was the committee's process. If there's any member of the committee, however, who feels that there's a different motion that's appropriate because they would like to deal with this as a separate issue, I think I need to hear that. I don't, Kathy,
Yeah, I raised my hand just, Andy, I'm comfortable with this broad motion, but I'd like the wording when we talk about the schools to say we strongly support going to full-time, that this issue of art and technology, and we believe that it can, from what we can see, it can be managed within the budget. I mean, I've actually had supporters of the schools be writing me about this, but maybe we can't use that wording and we just leave this more general. Because that's the reason. It's not that I'm not sympathetic for going from 80% to full-time, but I think that they can do it. So
I think it should be a separate motion.
Okay.
So if you're going to make it a separate motion,
I was just talking about the wording when we describe the discussion we just had, that we talk about the support of the school system. So we don't leave it that we just a blank. And I'm going to trust Andy that you can write some sentences that reflect what the conversation we just had.
certainly can be done if that's the committee's will, because as you know, what I've been looking for today is discussion on a number of issues that are going to inform the report. Michelle?
I agree that I would very much like to see that in the report, and also wonder, is the report the best mechanism for broadcasting that, or the only mechanism for broadcasting that? I mean, do people read the report? I do, but I'm just wondering if others do. And so are there other ways? I heard Lynn just say it would have to be a separate motion. I also heard Lynn say, or could be, right? And I also heard Lynn say something really important about, our role in not directing the superintendent how to spend money. And so I have concern about what a motion might do in that. So as long as we include it in the report and find good ways that we can get that message out, I think that we're safe doing it that way.
Michelle, I think you're right on with that.
And I think it's a matter of process, just so that everybody's aware of the process, that we will, I would work on a draft of the report, the longer version, and that explains our reasoning. And I will include something about that. That the draft as I have done with other committee reports, will go out to the entire committee. We cannot discuss that in any fashion by email that involves an actual discussion, but I will certainly be looking for comments from all committee members about the draft that I will be sending out. And the reason that I split the report process is that it allows a little bit more time so that we can actually have a back and have that process occur where I get comments from the committee and can consider comments from the committee and suggestions about changing wording in the draft. But I have to keep it as it is because we don't want to have to post meeting to have just wordsmithing. So that's what I was trying to do. So I think that at that point, we probably should hold the motion for later discussion and go on to at least the two other topics that we've identified and any others that might become identified as we go along. One thing that therefore we need to move to is the question of the public safety budget and whether there's any discussion that people want to have. We know that there are members of the public who have made very strong statements about the police budget, and I wanted to at least provide the committee an opportunity to discuss whether there was any what their reaction was, and to allow one more round of public comment on that subject, because I think that we would, if we're going to reduce the budget, we do have the opportunity to make that motion. And before we get there, I want to see if there's anybody who wants to have discussion on the topic. So with that said, I'll turn to Bob.
Thanks. Sean, I have a question for you. What if we look at the actual expenditures in but not just the police department, but the fire department together, are we seeing any trends over time? In other words, we've budgeted X, but we spent a little less, or we spent a little more. Can you give us a little bit of background on that?
And Sonia, you can feel free to add to this since you do the quarterly reports. I think for at least a little bit of time, the police had some vacant positions. However, two of them were reduced in the budget a couple of years ago, or maybe it was just this past year. And they have moved to fill all those vacant positions, I believe. So so I don't anticipate there being that same type of savings that we've had in the past. And then the fire department, I believe typically they fully expend their budget, or maybe go a little bit over, but I don't think they have a lot of savings either. But Sonia, maybe you can pull up your report and double check that.
Yeah, I can say from past history, police and fire have always been really tight budgets. Like Sean said, when we had the position, a lot of vacant positions in the police department last year, that created a lot of turn back there. But for the most part, we're watching it really closely from the third quarter on to make sure they're not going over. It's basically just vacancies, the timing or filling vacancies that turns any money back.
Yeah. And those departments both have quite a bit of lead time for filling vacancies because of either the academy or getting certifications and things like that. So that's one of the reasons why their vacancies are open a little bit longer than other departments.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thanks for that background.
Mm-hmm.
Kathy?
I thought the discussion we had, and I want to come back to the larger budget issues later on this, Andy, because some of the questions I sent in were more about this as we bring in CRES and how does it interact with dispatcher, with police, with fire. I thought we had a really good discussion on the very thoughtful, careful way of bringing on this new innovative workforce, with Earl in particular talking about training's important, making sure we have protocols and the sense of teamwork that was going on, that we're going to know a lot more a year from now on what can move off a list of things the police are doing that can move entirely to CRES, or sometimes in teams. And it sounded like that CRES will also be interacting with EMS in multiple ways. And the spokesperson for this that was the most eloquent was Earl, talking about how he really wants to have the time to bring the right people in, to give them the right training, and to learn by doing, and then to learn again. And so we're in this learning year. So I thought it was a very strong case for this budget reflects this transition period. And we will know more a year from now. So even with dispatchers, we got an estimate that about 10% of the calls, and they said they don't know yet because the protocols aren't in. So they were doing hand sorting on what could be directly shifted, but that there will be some going out. So I think we'll have a much better, to what extent we're generating new work that wasn't being taken care of before, and mental health work in the schools, and how much we can take over some of the functions that the police have traditionally been doing. So I felt very comfortable with the discussion that came out, and we pushed Earl pretty hard on some of these issues. And he, in particular, I wrote some quotes down from that day, because he said the one thing he doesn't want to do is undermine anybody's confidence of the people we're bringing in. He wants them to feel confident and competent when they go out, so they feel like they can really be proud of the work they do and not put them in an at-risk situation. So it seems so thoughtful, and I guess we're going to have our first hires pretty soon. So this is our FY23 really will be our first year that will have a lot of experience 12 months from now. That was my general impression of the discussion, and the collegiality was amazing, as people talked about how they how they have been working together, but how they want to work together looking forward.
Lynn?
Yeah, first of all, I want to commend the people who have worked hard to bring CRES on. One of them is here in our committee. Another one is in the audience, Brianna Owens, and our police department and our fire department. Looking back over the last, I think now 3 budgets, 2 years ago, we took 2 positions out of the police, and we have not restored them. Last year, the town manager came in with 4 responder positions, and I think it was a race for whether Pat DeAngelis or I were going to do the motion to increase it to 8, and the town manager came back to us with a budget amendment in the middle of the budget process that included 8, and that was established on a piece of faith that we could get, in fact, grant money. And in fact, we did. In this year's budget, we've maintained all of that. So the CRES is now funded at 10. We have added 4 positions for fire using the ARPA money, 4 very needed positions for fire. And we still maintain the 2 positions for police. My bottom line is we will not know the impact of where we stand today until a year, maybe even 2 years from now. And we will only know that if we have a serious and comprehensive evaluation system that will allow us to not just look at numbers, but to look at the stories. This is a quantitative and qualitative evaluation that is needed. Up until we get that, I would like to see us not agree to any more changes, but to embrace what we have, support what we've started, and allow people to get going on the jobs they're being hired for. Thank you.
Michelle?
Andy, I'm wondering if you would be willing, or if somebody would be willing to frame the advocacy. So what was in that public comment, what did you perceive was being requested? And I have several other questions and comments, but I first would really like to have that, to know that from your perspective or anyone's perspective. I'm trying to understand, what is the ask?
It's a hard one because I think that there were numerous comments from various individuals who raised different questions. Some were raising questions about whether we needed all of the officers that we have on staff. Some people were raising questions about whether the officers being, or police department staff is being overpaid. I think there was some questions being asked about other expenditures made within the police department that were really not personnel issues, but where there could be cuts possible. So there was this whole set of different arguments being presented, and sort of gets to my just general observations, which is that I'm sort of uncomfortable going there because salaries are determined by collective bargaining, and I respect the collective bargaining process. And the council is not a part of the collective bargaining process. That's up to the executive branch of the government. And so we don't really have a role there. And I think what Kathy was referring to earlier was just sort of the concerns that were raised by the question of staffing, that feeling that being expressed by Earl and others. And I think has generally been our philosophy as a council previously, is that we're looking for experience to inform us about what is going to be the appropriate staffing going forward, that we don't have the ability to make that determination now. And I think that the last thing that I would put in for my own comment on the subject, and then I want to get back to other members of the committee, is that we need to sort of recognize that it's really not that huge a police department staff when it comes down to it, because by the time you covered the number of shifts that are out there, that we were told during the budget hearings that that we had in recent meetings when the public safety hearing was had, that in most times of the day there are only 3 officers on patrol, and we want to make sure that they can respond to critical situations that have to be addressed by the police department, and that we not put Crest staff at risk by going out into uncomfortable situations where there may be a risk factor, even though it could be determined fairly quickly, that either on an individual call basis or a larger call basis, that we don't need that level of staffing. But I think we need experience to find that out, and we don't want to risk going forward, which is, I think, what we heard from Earl. So those are the things that make me feel like the recommendation from the town manager was well thought out. Alicia?
Thank you, Andy. So I think, like, I share some of the concerns of constituents in regards to the budget, and I just want to explain why. And so I was a member of the CSWG. Our purpose was to look at the police department and figure out what services that they currently perform can be outsourced to other departments. That was like our specific request of our group. And so we identified, and a lot of this, the like final information in this is in the LEAP report, specifically because they analyzed all of the call data from the APD over a number of the last years to figure out which call types can be moved to the CREST program. So that is, there is already existing data to back some of this. Like, we're not necessarily waiting for data to come in to figure that out. Like, we already have identified which calls we think can be moved to the CREST department. And so we're not creating new work, right? Like, this is not CREST responding, moving some of the responsibilities from the concern there, I think, is that how come the funding doesn't reflect those changes and that they're being looked at as separate? Because again, these programs are working in conjunction because they're addressing the same thing, public safety. And so I think that's where some of the concerns come from in terms of the budget and how it's set up. Also additionally, another recommendation that was made by the CSWG was that vacant positions not be filled. And this is another important step in terms of assessing where we are at, because, like, for example, if we were to come and see for next year that maybe one of the positions doesn't necessarily need to be in the PD and we want to move that position theoretically in terms of funding to the CREST department, but we have already filled that position with a police officer. Now we have to fire somebody. And rather than firing somebody, we have a vacant position which can be moved over. So those were our thoughts in terms of approaching the situation and sort of setting ourselves up for the transition rather than continuously waiting it out to see what else we can do next and sort of being prepared for the next steps.
Okay, thank you. Bernie?
Yeah, two things made me feel comfortable with the community responder proposal, the CREST proposal, because I frankly was underwhelmed by the community safety working group's version. The first thing obviously was Earl. The day it was announced that he was hired, I sent him an email saying, it's nice to see somebody who's had substantial human services, street level human services experiences coming in and willing to take this job. I'm familiar with a lot of the territory he covered. That was one. The second thing is the LEAPS report, which really does take a hard look at how CREST should operate, make some great suggestions, and as Earl said, will be a blueprint for implementing the program. I'd also point out the CAHOOTS, which is the grandmother of all these, has been around for over 3 decades. In Eugene, Oregon. It's funded through the Eugene Police Department. And folks are still debating how much goes back and forth in terms of CAHOOT's role and the Eugene PD's role. So it's going to take us, I think, and Lynn's right on target, that it's going to take us a couple of years to see how this plays out. Who takes what role, how much time it takes. I don't look at the police department, EMS, and CREST as competing organizations. I look at them as collaborative organizations. And we're going to have to figure out between in that matrix how things move and how things pan out. So, you know, I think I'm in favor right now of keeping the police department as it is, as there's sufficient funds and sufficient personnel to implement CREST. We can see how things go. There may be some benefits to, you know, decreased response times on the part of the police if there is some of these calls are handed off to CREST that they ordinarily would take. So we're going to have to figure it out. And my guess is from building programs, it's going to take 2 to 3 years to really get a handle on where we're at, what works best, because the kinds of issues that CREST and the police and EMS deal with don't come in neat little packages. Taking one police officer off the street you can't take one police officer off the street necessarily. It's like, it's basically the same issue as the schools face. Kids don't come in nice, neat, even bunches. That's the same thing with public safety. You know, that's again, I appreciate the advocacy, but my preference is that we maintain the status quo until CREST gets in place and we have some substantial operating time so we can make some good decisions.
Alicia, back to you. And then where I'm going to go after that, just so that you know, is I'm going to allow more public comments, because I know that Brianna's in the audience, and if she raises her hand when I ask for additional public comment, I want to bring her in the room. But Alicia, why don't I go to you first before doing that?
Thank you. I just wanted to make a couple of clarifications because we studied the other safety services around the country, as well as in Amherst, and the community and their response. And we studied very in depth the CAHOOTS program, which is an internal program, which is why they're completely funded by the police department, because they are quite literally a part of the police department. And we crafted CREST specific to Amherst needs, which is different than the CAHOOTS program. And we were also very specific about that in our report. And we identified it as something to be separate from the police department, not an internal arm of the PD. And so that is why. And so we're not trying to create two competing departments, just two different departments. And that they will address situations in different ways. And so when we had some of these conversations with the PD, there are certain things that they said that they respond to simply because there is nobody else to respond to them, and that they're not necessarily police matters. Those are the kinds of things that we're looking to move to the CREST department, not obviously crimes, emergencies. Those things will reside with the police department. We have no intention of moving those things. But still, again, just to emphasize, we're not creating need that doesn't already exist. We're shifting things. And I think that is what is being missed in the conversation, is that we're looking to shift some things from one place to another. And so if you're thinking about it like the schools, and you have a program in one school and you're moving it to another school, you're going to move the staff with the kids to the other school. It's the same kind of thing. The funding is going to follow where the services are being completed. And so I think that's what we were looking to happen. And I do agree that it's going to take a couple of years to get a good sense of exactly how this is going to work. And so that is, though, again, why we suggested it to be set up this way, because we do know that there is a significant strain on the budget, and we don't want to be coming up to this in 3 to 4 years when we already know our budget is going to be very strained. And then at that point being oh my goodness, what are we going to do? We don't have the funds. We didn't plan for this. If we start planning now, it's a little bit more feasible. And I feel like we're just saying we're going to continue to wait at this point, which in terms of how our budget is structured is not going to be the wisest decision in terms of the longevity and the success of the CREST program. And so I'm not saying I know exactly what the right answer is, because I do not, and I'm very new to this, but I'm not sure that just waiting and seeing what happens is the correct or going to be the correct approach.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. I am going to pause for the reason I stated. If there's anybody who is an attendee who would like to make public comment for the committee, they certainly are welcome to raise their hand now. And if I see any hands go up from attendees, we will bring that person into the room so that they can speak to the committee on the discussion that we've just been having. So seeing no indication that anybody's requesting to make comment at this point. Michelle?
Yeah, I really appreciate your comment, Alicia. That was really helpful. And I think this really gets to the larger question that Andy was posing in his memo to Sean and to Paul yesterday, because there's concern that we won't be able to continue funding these programs. And what I'm hearing is that the underlying sense is And I agree that we, even speaking with Earl, I had a chance to speak with him last week, and he said, basically, even if I had the money, I wouldn't be able to spend it right now, something to that effect, So I think his sense is he wants to stand up. That's his wording. And he wants to get the program started and really see how things, as Alicia said, may shift around as a result of the various calls that come in and services being offered. I mean, this is one department, it's public safety. I totally agree with Bernie. I don't think that we need to set this up as competing, rather really, as Lynn said, evaluating very, very closely how the new program is being used. But again, the larger question is how do we ensure that we are able to continue to fund even at this level CRES? And is the question, if what's before us as a town council is the ability to reduce the police budget, does that mean that money, if it were reduced, would automatically go into CRES? And who's, so yeah, that's my thoughts right now.
Okay, thank you. Paul, I see you have now able to join us, so I'm going to welcome you to the meeting. And just in case you are not aware of it, we have a motion on the floor to recommend to the council to adopt the FY23 budget as recommended. We have had discussion about the school funding, and we have had discussion about the which you've been hearing for the last few minutes, but there has been nobody has made any motions to amend the motion that is on the floor at this time. So I just wanted to bring you up to date on the process, but your hand was up, so please.
Yeah, thank you, Andy, and I apologize for being late. We were actually interviewing CRES responders this morning. That it was scheduled before the Finance Committee had scheduled this meeting, so I apologize for not being here. And a couple things. One is, I do ask you to vote in support of the budget as presented. This, I don't think it's not in CRES's interest nor our interest to reduce the budget of the police department, if that's what people are talking about at this point in time. Earl has done a spectacular job of building this department. And I think it's not just shifting 911 calls. We even heard someone today from the community who we are interviewing who talked about people aren't calling 911, and this is some of the testimony that came out from the CSWG work, is that people don't call 911, and there are calls that are going uncalled because of lack of trust, and that part of CRES's job is to reach into the community and create some kind of trust that way. And I thought it was a very important comment for us to hear from a potential responder to say that that's one of the reasons she was interested in pursuing this. And in terms of building this as the third leg of public safety, that's been a really important task that Earl has taken on, because our goal is to establish this as a legitimate program for years into the future. Part of that is through funding. Part of that are some steps that we've taken specifically to build this program. We've done it very judiciously. We've planted it in public safety. The city of Northampton is planting it in public health. Substantial difference between the two approaches. We think we're on the right track. We're looking at this in a really positive way. The jobs we're creating, the responder jobs, are unionized jobs. We want this program to succeed and be established in the community. And I think we've got really strong leadership, and we're going to have some great responders who are very representative of the community. I think it's really geared up for success. The long-term funding will be a challenge, but I think we will continue to work on that, because we're really committed to making sure the CRES program becomes a success and a model going to the future. And I would, if you start looking at the relationships with APD and AFD are really crucial to success, because it's a team effort, and with very distinct roles. that we are recognizing. So, so that's why I want to mention at this time.
Well, thank you. One other thing that came up, Paul, during the discussion, and it came actually, and I see Alicia's hands up, so I'll get back. Alicia, I will get to you in a second. But the question that came up is about if a vacancy occurs, one of the recommendations made during public comment at the budget hearing was that if vacancies occur, that we not fill positions, so that we don't, if we decide to reduce the police department after gaining the experience of the CREST program in action, that we can do so without having to actually lay off officers. And I do recall that comment having been made, and of course, you would have the judgment, just because the budget is there. If a vacancy occurs, you have the judgment whether to fill it or not. So it would seem that at this point, we're not aware of vacancies and that we need the funding. Am I correct on that?
Yes, and I think the staffing model that the police department has put together requires the staffing that's been recommended.
Okay, Alicia.
Thank you, Andy, and thank you, Paul. That was helpful. I think another thing that would be helpful, or that would help to sort of alleviate some of the concerns of the public, is if they could see or understand what our plan is to support CREST. Because again, that was our proposal. That was what we came up with as a CSWG as to what we thought would be a good way to be able to make sure that there is funding. Because again, essentially, it just means we're not looking for funding that doesn't already exist within our budget. We're moving funding. If that's not the right way, that's fine. But I think we want to know then how are we going to do it? And I think that will help sort of alleviate some of the concerns, because again, it's the, well, we'll wait and see how it's going to work, or we'll figure it out as we go along. That is the concern. And then, sorry, I lost my train of thought there, but basically, I think that is the main concern, is that we want to know what the plan is to ensure that CREST, it has longevity. Like, is our plan just, we're going to continue to look for grants this whole time to fund it for the next X amount of years? Or like, what is our solid concrete plan? And also, I remembered, what is our evaluation mechanism? So like, what are we going to be looking at? How are we going to be able to tell what should happen? And I think that's one of the other things, that if we can set that up in place now, or like have an idea of how we're going to be evaluating the program, that will be helpful for the public to know, so that they can understand what the process is, because I think that is where the, some of the concerns are coming from right now.
Paul?
If I can, yeah. So those are two great questions. And I think, we are, as Earl has been saying all morning, we are moving at rocket speed in terms of getting people hired and in place. And these things take a lot longer than we always anticipate. And I think the evaluation question is a really key one, because that's something we really want to focus on, is it working? Is it successful? And how do we measure in the community? And so we have to move in that direction. In terms of a long-term strategy for funding, I think we can put that together and sort of identify what we know and what we don't know, because there are a lot of unknowns and things that we're discovering along the way, that I think are the vision is one thing, and we put a lot of trust in Earl to build this program, and he's really done it in a very thoughtful, collaborative way, which I think will lead to its success. So, but you're asking for some specific questions about that. All sounds good, well and good, but tell me how the money's going to work, and I think we can look at that. We won't have all the answers for that, but we can put something on paper for you on that.
And if I could just add to that quickly, I mean, it depends on how many positions we fund. So we have 10 positions in the budget that are going to be funded into the future. I think the evaluation process will tell us if we need more positions, and if we do, then we'll go through the budget process to figure out where those funds come from. But as of right now, we have the 10 positions fully funded within the budget. That was the council's directive, and so that's there.
Isha, you have anything more?
Yes, sorry, I just wanted to follow up a bit. Thank you, both Sean and Paul, that was helpful. I also just wanted to re-emphasize that the information that I think I would be looking to have is not only like the concrete plan for the funding, but for the evaluation in terms of the funding. So like we can evaluate the program and determine, yes, it's successful, but at what point do we determine they need more funding, they need more positions, I think is the real question, because a success can also mean that this is how it stays and it's successful like this and we're just going to leave it as is. So I want to know like what we'll be looking at to determine whether or not we need to find more or increase the funding for CREST specifically. And then also additionally, just to re-emphasize the concern is that we don't want to say, we're going to wait till the budget process and then find where the money is going to come from then, because as we see every time in the budget process, it's really hard to find money for positions when you're in the midst of the budget process. And so I just want like a clear plan as to how will we be approaching that in the years to come.
We need to see if the response. Otherwise, the only hand up is Michelle. So Michelle.
I was surprised when I spoke to Earl to learn, and Paul, correct me if I'm wrong, but there hasn't been a new department since like the 80s or something that has been added. Is that true?
I think I don't even know if, I think it much farther back than that.
Back in that, okay.
Yeah.
He said the 80s, but yeah, I was really.
This morning he said horse and buggy the last time.
Okay. And I think that's really important for us to recognize is that, you know, this is a new department. And I'm actually very curious to know how a new department is evaluated. Who does the evaluation? I think with this innovative new department, it's especially important. And as Paul said, the world is watching us. I mean, we really are leading the way on this, which is really amazing. But how will we evaluate success, as Alicia said, but also really understand, you know, whether we need more or less or some other version or whatever it might be. So I hope we'll continue to have that discussion with respect to evaluation.
So anything further at this point? Because if I'd like to turn to the last topic of the morning then, and I will again put out, as I have before, just want to make it really clear that we now have a motion on the floor. It's been on the floor for a while, and we understood what's going on. That any further motion would be a motion to amend to reduce a section of the budget. And if there is no such motion offered at the conclusion of the discussion, we will then vote on the motion as it is. So that motions to amend is the only thing that's available. And since none has been offered, I want to turn to the last subject. And that is the sustainability of all of our planning, including the CREST department going forward, and the issues that I raised in the memo that I forwarded to you, and the responses, which I very much appreciate from Sean and from Paul earlier. Lynn.
Andy, if you want to go and start, that's fine. If you want me to start, I'll start with my list of what's making me nervous.
Go ahead.
I'm pleased that we are looking at a budget like we are this year. I actually think we can sustain all of it. And I hope we will look toward the future. But I'm looking at this budget and I'm nervous, and here's why. We're in unprecedented inflation that is not in this budget. We have to build a new elementary school, or we're going to be spending untold amounts of money to repair 2 old elementary schools. And we have 2 other identified capital projects on the books and others that are being asked for. We have an extraordinary and unprecedented amount of grant money right now. This is one-time money. It's spend it and done. And we're relying on it to, in fact, balance a budget that is rich with program. We have 16 new positions in this budget. 10 for CRES, 4 for fire and EMS, and 2 for DEI. And we're in a year of contract negotiations, all of which could change what we're looking at. So I applaud the town manager for giving us what appears to be a balanced budget, but this coming year is going to need to be scrutinized, as Sonia has said on more than one occasion, and Sean has cautioned us about, because of all of the issues that I just laid out. Thank you.
I think that I'm looking for hands if there are other thoughts about it, but I'll turn to Kathy. Why don't I just go ahead and give it to Kathy, because I know you have some questions.
Well, I want to build on what Lynn just said, and it's a request not for right now, Paul and Sean, but going outward, you can't really see the fact that we just added all these positions on line items. And I know some of it is being supported by ARPA money. Some of it was supported by a mental health grant. Some of it was supported by, but I think at some point it would be nice to see some of these as line items. And I went back to try to piece together, and I didn't do a good job when I first looked at the budget. So you had given us a great memo on CRES on the cost of it. And then I looked at the cost for the 10 positions and realized I didn't see all of it because we still had some mental health or other grant offsets. But I understand more about the way the budget's done, that if you have a grant, the general fund is picking up the part that's not picked up by the grant. So we're seeing pieces of it. So I think as we go into the fall, it would be really useful to see this 5-year budget with, it all works because we're assuming 2.5% that we can live with it. And 2.5% worked pretty well when we didn't have inflation. It may not have actually worked great, but it worked better when there wasn't inflation. But when we hear that we can pave fewer roads because the cost of tar is up, because the cost of oil is up, I mean, the way inflation will trickle through our budget, we're going to know more with Sonia's reports. But Lynn's phrase of making her nervous, this makes me nervous. We don't know at the federal level and at the state level whether we will continue to have a federal government that's supportive of state governments who then are supportive of municipal governments. And I would hope that we are. But if the state would come up with money, if our strategic negotiations for the programs would come up with money, it would ease my feeling of what does FY 24, 25, 26, 27 look like. Because when I add up step increases, forget COLA increases, but step, and I said this last fall, so I am repeating it, but if I add health insurance increase, pension increase, step increase, COLA increase, supply costs, it doesn't add up to 2.5% increase in a labor intensive budget. So I just think we will need to be taking the close look in the fall, the way we have in the past, but really with where are there storm clouds on the horizon and where do we see the relief? And Andy's at MMC with policy, MMA, bringing state funds in, not just in a one-time level, but if we ever got an infrastructure bill that actually said, we're helping you with your infrastructure, it'd be great. And that's, I just want to end there, but I just feel like we're underfunding at the state level. You know, the idea that the school granting authority is not living up to its promises in the past of matching, that they're just cutting down what they're putting limits on it because they don't have a growth in the pot of money to expend. They're not doing it to be mean. Means that the state is not robustly funding the support systems that have enabled municipalities, for at least schools, to build their schools. So it's across the board, and it's not just construction costs, but it will be our food costs. We haven't seen what's going to happen with food inflation yet. If grain products, if it starts rolling across between weather and what's happening in Europe. So I'll stop there, but it's nervous making rather than no one is predicting where this is going at a national or state level yet. So I'm just going to echo Lynn's on what's making me nervous. And I put together a bunch of numbers, but I'll just do them on what it's hard for me. I have to be a detective to figure out what's holding the out years together. And I'd rather not just have to do detective work. I know you all have done this work and where you think you're going to fill the holes.
John?
Yeah, thank you. So I think those are exactly the right questions, the right focus area when we're talking about all the new initiatives that are being discussed. In the budget document, you know, we do have the 5-year forecast. When I look at that 5-year forecast, this is the high level, the big picture budget. I'm not, you know, I think there's some cautions when I look at that. I don't think there's anything that's stop at the high level. I think the area where we start to see some more you know, where we really need to buckle down are within the operating budgets, which again, as Kathy said, you can't really see all that detail. But at a high level, in terms of our revenues matching our expenses, we seem to be in pretty good shape going forward. I think we tried to emphasize it this year, and we'll continue to emphasize it, that we really need to focus on the operating budgets because of inflation, because of these new programs, and just because we all heard from many departments this year that they're stretched with all the new responsibilities that they have. And that we really need to shore that up before we take on new commitments. So I think you'll hear Paul and I echo that going forward. There's lots of new initiatives, and they're things that are really worthwhile. It's not like they're, you know, they're frilly things, but you know, I think doing 4 building projects in a decade, adding 2 new departments, the CARP plan that came out, like, to me, that's, you know, maybe I'm crazy, but to me, that's 10 years, 15 years worth of work. I mean, in terms of funding, in terms of new things, you know, I think Paul said earlier, you know, usually you do a building project once a decade, and we're trying to do 4 in a decade because they haven't been done in the prior 3 decades. So I think we have to keep that in mind as we, you know, we've got sort of these priorities, which I think the council has stated, the EMS staffing, the CREST program, the 4 building projects, DEI. I think those are all sort of widely accepted priorities, and then the CARP as well, or at least making progress on the CARP. So when we start talking about new things, again, it would be really helpful to keep those in the context of the stated priorities.
Okay, thank you, Bernie.
Yeah, I think as we go forward with this, it's helpful to remember that Amherst makes up about 0.5% of the Commonwealth's population. So we think highly of ourselves, but actually we're a small place. And we're trying to do some things that are a real stretch. And that's not to say that we shouldn't do them. It's my admiration that we're trying to do things. We're doing stuff that Prop 2.5 was designed to prevent. It was designed to keep governments from effectively serving populations. A couple of concerns out there is, you know, inflation is going to drive up our expenses. It's also going to drive up the value of housing, which is going to have an impact on taxes. And I know that citizens are going to feel that. They're going to feel that pinch if you know, when their property is now all of a sudden worth 11, 12% more than what it was the previous year. The other thing we have to pay attention to is the muni market, because we're going to have to bond this stuff. And right now, things are sort of falling out with munis. People have been passing them by, which means that we may be facing higher interest rates than we've projected. So those are things that we've got to, those are things that are way out there. We have to keep in mind. And I appreciate the fact that there's a 5-year projected revenue stream and budget in the budget book. But again, not seeing that detail, not seeing how those 4 firefighter EMS staff get folded into the budget. I think seeing some of that would be helpful, at least for me as a geek. The other thing that I'll mention again is that I do think that the town administration is understaffed. I think the span of control that Paul has is too large. I appreciate the fact that he's willing to roll staff off into new roles and new departments. I think, I announced a couple of weeks ago I was going to form the Friends of the Finance Department organization to help promote that department and the need for staffing in there. So as we go forward, the thing that makes me nervous is when you apply the hit by a bus test. We don't have a lot of depth. We don't have. I think we're not staffed as well as we should be on an administrative level. So that's my advocacy. Not that I don't. We're messing with a wide variety of priorities and needs. I think having a community response program, having worked at Human Services for 30 years, I think having a community response program is essential. Having one that's cost effective is equally essential. So we need to be able to look at that. Our EMS ability is stretched. The firefighter ability is stretched. We need to be careful and look at that. So I want to thank you guys, Sean, Paul, Sonia, for the huge amount of work you've done on this. But like some of the other members on the Finance Committee, I have butterflies in my stomach over some of what's happening. So thanks.
Yeah, just seeing our hands going up, I'll take a moment. I mean, as I said at the beginning of the meeting, raised this question yesterday and consulted with my vice chair about it, and Kathy agreed that this was an important issue to bring forward, and so I did so on behalf of the committee with that endorsement. And part of it goes back, I do think, to what you just said about Proposition 2.5 being the source or the beginning of sort of my analysis, because it does cap what we can raise ourselves. And we don't have the ability to do anything else. Whether we would even choose if we had the ability to raise taxes more we do have that by override, but I think we're all anxious because of recognizing the stress that our own residents are under, and that puts a caution there too. We've survived the 2.5 all of these years because the legislature has stepped up to the plate and has done as much as they could with local aid, and I appreciate that. That has enabled us to stay at 2.5% for increases. But I always felt in the end that 2.5% only works as long as inflation is low. And over the years, it has been relatively flat, and we've been the beneficiary of that. But we're in an inflation period where we're just not certain whether that inflation is going to continue. I think that it's been already mentioned today. So I'm not sure that 2.5%, assuming we achieve 2.5% for growth in these next years, is going to work. And even when you do that, the projections going out were for a deficit, not in the first years, but farther down the line. And then we have the other problem, which I don't think is necessarily a problem, but on the financial side it is That is, we have a very ambitious and creative community, and there's a lot of other things that are out there in sort of the wish list of what we could do as a progressive community to make the lives of everybody better. And so whether it be on the reparations side or on the side of doing more to implement the climate action plan, or any of or to try and follow up with additional CSWG recommendations and create a cultural center, BIPOC cultural center, and a youth center that was recommended. There's just a lot of good wants out there, and we, you know, I think that 2.5%, it's questionable whether it can keep us where we are, and then what do we do with all of the other recognized unmet needs? So all of that makes me nervous about the future, and I think we just have to be willing to recognize that I don't know what else we can do because we are where we are. Lynn?
Well, we have Sean and Paul in the room. One of the questions that has been brought up is the price of homes and the sale. So we just went through a reassessment. Please tell me what year it was. And then for those of us that continue to live in our homes, but if we sold them, the price would go up. Will our homes be reassessed in a shorter time period than expected, or when will they be reassessed?
Yeah, so I won't get this perfect, but our assessor would do a better job of it. But there's sort of cyclical valuations where every so many years they're looked at. But the thing that's happened recently is the assessed value of a home has to be within so much of a range of the market value or the sales value that the assessor's seeing. And if that assessed value gets, I think it's 10% out of whack with what they're seeing for sales, then they have to do an immediate adjustment in the upcoming year. And so what you just experienced was an immediate adjustment because sales values have been going up so rapidly that the assessed values were getting too far below that. You'll probably see another one of those this coming year, again, because of how rapidly sales prices have been going up. So that does raise the assessed values. We're still capped at 2.5. So it doesn't mean the town is raising more from the tax levy. But it does sometimes result in volatility in terms of how the taxes are being distributed if some houses rise at a faster rate. But it doesn't mean we're collecting taxes at a higher rate. It's still capped at 2.5. Yeah.
Thank you.
You'll see that. I mean, you'll likely see the tax rate. The positive side of this is that you'll likely see the tax rate either stay flat or go down a little bit, which for Amherst is actually pretty important because Amherst, we're one of the higher tax rates in the Commonwealth. And the thing that we're always mindful of is there's a $25 cap on the tax rate that we can't literally raise taxes over $25 per thousand. And so we've seen the tax rate drop a little bit and hope to see that keep going that way.
Michelle?
I'm hesitant to ask this, but I'm going to do it anyway. I don't want to get into the weeds, but I am curious about the partnership agreements that we've been discussing, and I know that they're in negotiations. I have no sense of what they would yield, like 0 cents, like $100 or millions of dollars, so I'm just wondering, is there state percentages or something that we can look to say, okay, in our best case scenario, this is what we would receive. In our worst case scenario, this is based on some regulations, or are these numbers purely privately decided upon in the negotiation process?
So it's so these are voluntary agreements that the institutions enter into with the locality. So there's no baseline. We do look at other locations that are similar to us. So we look at Northampton and Smith. We look at Burlington, Vermont, with the University of Vermont. So we can look at some similar communities, but there's no specific framework. I think the best framework for us to look at is what have we done in the past, because we've had these now for, I don't know, 20 years, maybe longer. And so, we look to see what's been done in the past and then the narrative that's happened, and try to build upon that. So we're in those discussions now, so we can't speak to them too much. We hope to have them, wrapped up sometime in the not too distant future. But yeah, we can't say too much while we're still discussing them with them.
Understandable. If I could just ask a follow-up. So are the numbers from the past available somewhere publicly?
Yeah, so I can tell you in the past, like in our specific agreement with University of Massachusetts, there was I think the most recent agreement, which is no longer in effect per se. There was a reimbursement for ambulance services, which there was a formula that looked at the volume of calls that went to the university and so on. And that right now that pays about $400,000 per year to the town. And then there was a sort of general payment to the town of about $120,000, which was for sort of all the other services that the town provides. That latter payment has been sort of shifted, so they're no longer making that latter payment to the town. Instead, there was an agreement reached to give $185,000 to the schools. So they're giving us more than under the previous agreement, but it's coming to us differently. I think that might have been one of the questions I was asked. So the funds that Paul and I have at our discretion in terms of putting the budget together, those did go down a little bit when that expired, but the overall funds coming to the town are higher, and the schools have more funds at their disposal.
And sorry, Andy, one more follow-up. The Amherst College, are those numbers available, or has there been an agreement with Amherst College previously?
So Amherst College, correct me if I'm wrong, Paul, Amherst College didn't have a formal written agreement. We are looking to do that going forward. So that is also in the works to actually get everything put down into a formal document moving forward. But they also followed a similar ambulance reimbursement formula as UMass. So they would pay a percentage, and they again, because it was not written down, they've been helpful in terms of like rounding up or not doing like the exact amount, things like that. But in terms of other contributions, I think it's just the ambulance payment. Sonia, unless I'm missing something.
They used to make some donation to the school for a program.
Oh yeah, sorry, I'm silly. Obviously I should know that. Yeah, they also contribute $75,000 to the schools each year. Also, again, there's not really a formal agreement currently, but they give money to the schools to support the family center and after school tuition vouchers.
But that's where we're working right now with ultimately all three institutions to have a formal agreement with them about what to expect, so that we have more predictability and they have better predictability as well.
And is there anything that this committee can do to help with that process? Is there any drafting of anything? Is there anything within our purview? And of course, I look to Andy as the chair, but that we could be doing to help move, particularly with Amherst College, that process forward? And you don't have to answer that now, but
Yeah, I think to be determined. I think we'll
cool. Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
The court of public opinion can be loud.
I hear you. Yeah, thank you.
Go back to others because I see 3 hands up at this point, and just in order. Bob?
Yeah, I've mentioned this in previous meetings, but my biggest concern about sustainability are people costs. I mean, that's the bulk of what we spend on an annual basis in town. And we have long-term liabilities with OPEB and pensions that are people costs that will be in the future that we've already committed to. Sean, in your responses, and Paul, you talk about there's an uncertainty because we're engaged in collective bargaining now. But I'd like to flip that around and say we have an opportunity, because we're in collective bargaining, to look forward about the people costs and make sure that we try to stay within bounds that are affordable. Because otherwise we could just blow the budgets up, and then we'll really have to start cutting services. So I just want to reiterate again my concern about my worry about people costs. And, we have an opportunity now to try to address what the future will be on them. Thanks.
And Andy, maybe if I can just add to that real quick, just so since we're having sort of a general conversation about the long-term budget. So the two, I think, really important things that'll be coming up, one really far in the future, but one not so far in the future is, so the elementary school project that will consolidate 3 schools into 2. So that will be an opportunity, hopefully, to identify some efficiencies that can help all operating budgets. The other one that's a little bit farther in the future, not till 2034, unless the stock market really goes crazy, is our pension costs. So Bob touched on our pension costs. So right now we are, the majority or a large portion of our pension assessment is for all the past underfunding of the pension system. In 2034, our pension assessment should begin to drop off pretty precipitously, which will be helpful. We sort of are planning at this point that will then go into OPEB, or at least a portion of that will go into OPEB to fully fund that liability at a faster rate than we currently are. But that will be another opportunity to realize some structural cost savings in a pretty major way.
Sean, Matt?
Thanks, Andy. Sean, I was going to make that comment about the school consolidation in terms of Bob's point as well. And I guess I'm going to just raise something as a question, and I'd be interested in hearing this committee's perspective on it. Definitely Sean and Paul, but others as well. The school building committee right now is obviously trying to make a site selection. We know there's a relatively small difference between the 2 projected sites. I think something in the ballpark of 4.5, somewhere between there, I think was the difference on an early price projection for those 2 sites. But I think, speaking about long-term efficiencies and also opportunities for raising revenue and addressing other needs, I just looking at sort of the discourse that's out there publicly, it does feel as though a lot of the questions about what to do with the other building are being folded into the selection of which site is the appropriate site for the elementary school now. And so I'm wondering from a finance committee perspective, if folks have any thoughts in terms of, to use Bob's language, in what way can that be an opportunity for the town fiscally in terms of that decision? And it might not be an easy answer, but I thought I would ask the question.
Yeah, we'll get other people's comments on it, but it could be an opportunity for savings. It could be a liability if there's demands to use it for other purposes. Whatever happens to that vacant building depends upon how we proceed with it, and it's one of the things that I think needs to be recognized. But I want to continue on. Jennifer, good morning.
Good morning. I don't want to sidetrack, but I wanted to pick up on Michelle's question regarding the strategic agreements or the partnership agreements with the particularly UMass. I was going to, actually request to meet with you, Paul, but I thought maybe I'd take the opportunity of the public meeting just to ask or request that this be part of the partnership agreement with UMass. Last week in District 3, we had a meeting between almost 30 neighborhood residents and representatives from the town and the university. And a major focus was the 2 new dormitories that are being built at the corner of Massachusetts Avenue and Lincoln that will bring 800 additional students into precinct 10, I guess it's now precinct 4A of District 3. And the dorms are much more in the neighborhood than they really are located in what we think of as being the campus. And what we were told, because, again, there's will be 800 additional students, that the only way they can get to downtown from the dorms is to walk through a quiet residential neighborhood, is it was explained that University of Massachusetts police literally cannot set foot and do any patrolling outside of campus. So very soon after these students leave the dorm, they will no longer be literally geographically in an area where the university can provide any security, and it will be completely dependent on the town. And the police officer, the police officer that was there explained how there really isn't the capacity to be able to really provide any kind of, on the ground security for the students or the residents. So I wanted to ask if it's not too late in the negotiation with UMass in the partnership agreement, if the fact that the burden of these new dorms in terms of providing security to the students and the university is going to fall on the town, if that could be part of the negotiation.
So I can just add quickly, the agreement always leaves the door open for if new things arise or if circumstances change, for further discussions to be held related to the agreement.
But is it too late to have that be part of I mean, we know this is going to be a need. The dorms are going to open in fall 2023. There will be 800 additional residents basically in the district.
Yeah, I don't know if it's too late. I guess the question, it would be, what is it that we are, I think we'd have to discuss it more to find out what is the thing that we would be discussing, we would be asking for.
Right. I mean, just as an example, I don't want to belabor this, but recently at 3 a.m, lots and lots of firecrackers went off at a student house on Fearing. Oh, I am sorry. On Fearing and Sunset. And Fearing Street between Sunset and University is actually University of Massachusetts Street. And their security was there, but they literally couldn't walk, they couldn't come, whatever it was, the 50 feet to be of assistance until the Amherst Police Department got there. So it's that,
okay.
You can imagine the situation. Thank you. We can talk further offline.
Yeah, no, it is a difficult issue, and some of it, as I understand it, has to do with policies within the University Police Department and their collective bargaining with their officers. So
that's what we're told.
This,
yeah.
It is not a simple issue, but thank you for bringing it forward. Lynn.
Yeah, Matt and many other people, I appreciate the ongoing question about the remaining school site, but I want to be very, very clear in urging the fact that it is a decision of the school building committee to select which site. And if we start weighing in on what we might do with one site or the other, we start prejudicing their decision. That decision needs to be based on all of the unbelievable amount of information that they have received, they are debating, they are looking at, they are weighing. And only after they make that decision. And by the way, the school then decides the other building is no longer something they need. Does it ever become a discussion of the town as to what to do with that other building? So we're several steps away from that. And I appreciate the town and residents' creativity about what might be done with that building, but we're not there. It is the school building committee needs to be allowed to make the decision unencumbered as to which building is the best site for the new school. Thanks.
Before I call Michelle, Kathy, is your comment to be directly related to what's just now discussed?
Yeah, I'll just do it as a footnote. Of course, I completely agree with what Lynn just said, but we do have to get the voters to want to tax themselves for this building. And one of the selling points, a strong selling point, is a green net zero climate building. And right now we can save $250,000 because the two schools will no longer be operating. That's the cost of their utilities every year. That's annual. And that, so far, we're saying accrues directly to the town budget. So we just need to be careful going forward, because that will be that's how other towns have actually argued for photovoltaic. They've said, look, you're getting something for it. You're investing money and there's a return on it. So we need to protect those kinds of arguments, at least till we get through the vote, So this is going to be a big ask. And it's next spring, assuming MSBA approves our choice. We still have these hurdles we have to go through. It's a really complicated granting authority, which sometimes makes us write footnotes on the sentences and sends it back and says, would you rewrite the sentence? So it's not just do they like what we're proposing, but they want to wordsmith it too. So we do have to sell it. I mean, sell it. We have to make a good case for it is what is the way I would say it's best foot forward.
Thank you, Michelle.
Yeah, I do agree about not encumbering or giving at least giving the agency to the people that are going through the process. However, I do think from a proactive strategic standpoint, it is really important for us to be looking at possible uses for the vacant building as this decision is made. And I also just want to say that in the community, it's been noted that in a town council meeting last year, this conversation actually did occur. And I think even Lynn, you may have been the one who raised the question about how the vacant property should be used and what role the town council should have in thinking about that. So if we are addressing these questions, I think it's important to remember that there is a history that's on the record, and that is being raised in the community.
Yeah, I guess my one comment is I would distinguish several pieces. One is who makes the decision, but also that we get back to the question that we started with in this conversation, which is what can we afford to do? And we looking ahead, looking at all of the demands on our budget and what 2.5% increase in the operating budget and no more, and the increases for the capital budget being driven largely by building projects that we're already committed to, and the increases in costs for things like asphalt, which and other things, just general inflation questions, that the whole bundle of things that are happening, and we have to be realistic about what we can afford to do in addition to what we might desire to do. Sean, you had a comment that I want to get back to Alicia.
Yeah, I was just going to add that we also raised this during the 4 building project presentation, and it was raised in the sense of one of the items that would provide a buffer, could potentially provide a buffer should estimates come in higher, should things change. We raised the potential benefits of reduced operating expenses. One of the concerns during that was that the operating budgets could get pushed out a little bit by capital, and the cost savings from operating 1 building versus 2 was identified as one of the things that would provide some relief there. And then the other issue was just what if the interest rates come in higher, things like that, and the potential revenue to be gained from one of the sites, or actually 2 sites. I think we identified Central Fire Station as potentially becoming available, and then also either one of the school sites becoming available to actually generate revenue for the town as being one way to buffer those impacts. And I think the thing we'll say is obviously things have changed for the worse since that presentation in terms of construction costs and interest rates. So I think again, those things will be really important to consider when everyone makes their decision.
Thanks, Alicia.
Thank you, Andy. Yeah, so I also am wondering, because I think this is an important conversation for us to have, and I'm wondering what is the time and the setting for this, because I know the elementary school building committee will choose the site. And though in our report to the MSBA, we do have to indicate what we plan to do with the vacated school. So I know that this is a decision and conversation that needs to happen sooner rather than later, because that is something that we're going to have to submit to the MSBA at the end of this process. And so I also know the school committee is going to have their vote on consolidation as to whether or not they're going to consolidate the schools. So we don't know the outcome of that yet, but I'm assuming that they would do so. And I'm wondering, is that when they would have the conversation as to whether or not they would keep a building, or when that happened? Like, I'm looking for a timeline here, basically, is pretty much what I'm asking, is how all of these things, because they all depend on each other, right? And then after this, also, the outcome of all of those decisions will affect our budget. Also, looking at it as, I would like to see us looking into how retaining the extra town properties might affect our budget. But we would have to know what those decisions were first. So if that makes sense. So I guess I'm looking for like a clear timeline as to when these things happen and where they happen. Because I do think that ultimately it will turn into an important conversation for the finance committee to have, and possibly some research being done on the budget effects for years to come in terms of utilization versus not utilization of those properties.
Yeah, I mean, I think Kathy was going to jump in on the sort of the decisions that have been happened, but I'll just quickly add. So one of the ways that the capital improvement program, one reason why it's more in balance now than it used to be, is because, again, we were sort of operating under the assumption that whatever school is not selected, we were not going to invest significant capital funds into that site, because those schools need so much. I mean, they need new electrical systems, they both need roofs at some point in the near future. They're not accessible in many ways. We had an accessibility study done. They have lots of work on accessibility there. I mean, they have really significant capital needs. So just one impact that's really, I think, easy to see is that it would add a lot of money to the capital improvement program at a time where we are trying to actually reduce what we're spending from the capital improvement program, because a bigger portion is going to go towards these 4 building projects. So we actually have a period of time where we have to sort of tighten the belt in terms of other capital needs outside of those 4 building projects. And this would add a significant new, a new building to maintain beyond what we were planning.
Kathy?
Sorry, can I just follow up to that? Because Sean brought up something that I had meant to mention, but I forgot because I had so much in my head about the capital improvement project. Because then my next question was going to be, is that the time we would look at some of these things? Because I know at one point, both of the schools were on the capital improvement plan. And I think that was prior to us making the decision that we would move forward to our current plan. And I know that we're having like the public forum, and we're going to start going over that soon also. And so again, like, I think what would be helpful for me at this time, despite all of these general comments I'm making, is a timeline as to like when these decisions are made, because I think a lot of them affect each other.
So Andy, real quick, this won't be a decision point, but I think it'll contribute, is we will be updating the 4 projects, the 4 building projects presentation, given sort of the new realities that we're dealing with. And I think that will contribute to whatever discussion happens from there in terms of, can we maintain these buildings within the amount of money that would be available for capital?
Kathy?
I'll just, on MSBA, my understanding is we need to give an indication, but we don't need to sign in blood. Communities go through resource evaluation, and our first action as a council way back when was, I don't know what point we got the East Street School, but was to take the East Street School and leverage it. And now we've leveraged it into multi-housing units. So that sat on our books for quite some time. So I think the urgency on the one thing we have to do is we have to choose a site for the school. But the rest is they ask for sort of an indication of what you might be doing. And the granting authority, I can't underestimate underscore enough on how stingy they are with their money. They know the stress they're putting towns under. And they just go, that's your problem. We're not going to get the kind of matching grants that we had thought we were going to get because of the way they're capping the awards. So I just, stay tuned, but we will have that more concretely by the early fall on the current timeline.
Alicia, did you have a follow-up question?
Yeah, sorry, thank you. Because I mean, all of these comments are helpful, but I still think I'm maybe missing what I'm looking for. And that's just so what's happening in my head is, so we would have to indicate to the MSBA in the early fall what we possibly may do with the building. And that doesn't have to be what we actually do with it, but what we're leaning towards doing with it. But who would make the indication as to what we might possibly do with it if it wasn't the council? And how would the council have an indication if the school committee hasn't already made the vote as to whether or not they're going to retain the school? And so what I'm confused about is, when do we have are these on agendas and we're going to be voting on these things soon? Or I'm just confused as to how we're going to come to that.
So this won't be super helpful, but the good news is so we won't know for sure that there will even be a school available until the vote happens in the spring. So, once the vote happens, the exclusion vote or whatever the council decides to do with it, then you'll know for sure that there will be a school available.
Lynn?
So who will make the indication that goes in our report to the MSBA? Is that something that the school, we will decide with DNISCO that we don't need any other input from any other bodies? That's what I'm just trying to decide where the authority lies, within which committee and which process.
We sign just the simple answer, Alicia, they're signatories to everything that goes to MSBA. It's not DNISCO. Paul is signing off on it. The chair, we are right now for the school project. There is not a town council sign off on this document. And that's why I said it's not binding. It's an indication. And so we can write the words, write whatever that language is pretty broadly, because they're not going to come back and say, oh, this is what you said you're going to do with the other building. I'm not saying we don't have that discussion. I'm just saying that that doesn't have to be tied to the trying to get the granting authority to agree to give us the money so that we can go out and get the vote to do the school. I can send you the last document that was sent for the project that didn't go forward, and you can see what wording they put in it. And we can have a separate talk about, who needs to do what, but Paul and Sean and others have looked at every piece of wording that went into any document that went forward. And we can't bind the town as the building committee. We can just do the building committee part of it.
Okay. Go to Lynn and then Jennifer, in that order.
Yeah, Alicia, I have to say, I just totally appreciate your questions, because I've asked many of these questions along the way. And the whole MSBA process has been a learning process for me. The whole issue of how the school may move from being a school property to a town property has been a learning process for me. So you're asking questions that I think are incredibly relevant to what the town residents and the council has needed to come to understand. And part of my reason for wanting to understand them is the same thing you and other residents are looking at. And that is there any use for an existing empty building? And is there any use for an existing piece of land? And the answer is, I don't know. Okay. And as soon as it becomes relevant to a town council discussion, then it would go on an agenda. but we don't even know when. We don't know what. And that's kind of where we are. It's a learning process we've all been engaged in. So my questions in the past about, well, what about this vacant school, have been very much like the ones you're asking. And my learning process has been very much like the one we're all now going through.
Jennifer, I'm sorry. Yeah, thank you for being patient.
Oh, no, that's okay. I just want to say that in terms of, so will there be a discussion of how the vacated building might be used before the funding goes before the public on the ballot for the override? Because I do think there are residents for whom how the vacated building will be used will actually weigh into their decision, for better or worse, in how they are going to vote. I mean, there are many people that feel like we really need a youth center, a senior center, and that if they knew that the vacated school building could be used for some of these services that they really, really want, that might actually be a factor in how they vote. So I think the timing is important here.
Yeah, no, it's a good point, but it's also a very difficult one to deal with, because we get back to the question of what we'd like to do and what we can afford to do is two separate questions. And I'm not sure what we can afford to do given what we already talked about this morning regarding where the budgets are going in the future. And the other thing that people who are voting on whether or not to support a debt exclusion override will be voting on is the effect on their taxes. And to the extent that we make decisions that are going to otherwise limit their taxes so that they get the most bang for the buck, that's a thing too. And they're making essentially the same decision then that we are. The desire for the senior center at the old site, for example, versus the cost. And it's a difficult balance. And
I agree. I'm just relating what's been expressed to me.
No, I think it's important, but it comes out on both sides, unfortunately. Wish there was an easy answer, in other words. Alicia, and then I want to try and draw it to a close.
Yeah, thank you. I also wanted to quickly emphasize what Jennifer just said, because I had a similar thought, but I think that also is something that the school building committee can look at and think about, because that's going to be really like what they should be thinking about when we're deciding how to do outreach and get people excited about the project when we do come to the end. But I still also want to go back to my previous questions, because what I'm still missing is the timeline. And I hear that like we may possibly be not making this decision for a long time. So there is no timeline. Is that like the answer to my question? Because I'm still slightly confused as to how we plan this then. So do we just like wait for this to happen and then we decide what we're going to do? Or do we have like a plan for either which turnout just in case? Or because I'm just like confused as to how we will prepare for the outcome if we don't discuss it or anything about it until we get all the way to that point. Because again, I think that we would want to be able to study specifically how these decisions will affect our budget moving forward and our town finances. And also, like, we gave $500K of the ARPA salary for a feasibility study to the rec department. And so if they do a feasibility study, which we don't know the outcome of that yet, but if it comes to be that it is feasible, where are we going to house it? And when is that going to happen? And are we going to be prepared? And so I think that there are so many things that we should be looking into. And so again, I think a timeline would be helpful, like when and who should be looking into these things. That's what I don't know. Like, I don't know where to put these ideas. And I guess like, I know we're coming to an end, so I don't necessarily need this answered right this minute. But if there's somebody that can like write down this timeline, or like, is there a deadline or a time of the year that we look at these things? That would be helpful for me.
I think that's actually a helpful way to get to a conclusion, because maybe we should have a discussion, or Lynn needs to have a discussion with Paul and with Sean about what is the timetable for all of the pieces and what decisions have to be made at which point. And to the extent that they're financial, I can participate as finance committee chairman. To the extent that they're MSBA related, Kathy should be participating as chair of that committee. But it probably ought to start with the council president and town manager and finance director trying to figure out what decisions need to be made in what order. Lynn, are you agreeable to that as a way to?
I accept the challenge with serious concern. And just know that there could be more question marks in the timeline than there might be answers, but I absolutely accept the challenge. And I do think a lot of it depends on Sean's timing and ability to update the model for the capital expenditures, which includes not just the large projects, but includes what we put aside every year for other capital projects as well. And then the other thing I wanted to note is that this is for the minutes, that Jennifer Taub has left the meeting, but we still have a quorum of the council.
Okay. So Sean, back to you, and then I'm going to bring this to a close.
Just two really quick things. I just wanted to clarify the 500,000 from ARPA, and it must be, I think I saw it written down somewhere in a way that was confusing, but just for the record, it's not for, the 500,000 isn't for feasibility, it's for implementation of whatever outcome there may be with it. So the original intent of that 500,000 was to solicit outside groups to potentially create a youth empowerment center, to provide them some grant funding as sort of startup costs or transition costs as they would come in, like a YMCA or a Boys and Girls Club. We transitioned to studying an in-house program first before we would move forward with that. So just, again, the whole amount is not for a feasibility study. And the second question, so I think today, if Kathy's here today or tomorrow, we're supposed to get updated cost estimates on the school building project. Again, I've been a little reluctant to dive into it too far until we get solid cost estimates, now that we have the designers on board. And as Kathy can attest, they're changing frequently, the cost estimates, because it's just how volatile the market is right now. But I think we will have a solid basis of cost estimates for the school project to move forward with in the near future. So I'll work with Paul and Lynn to come up with a timeline.
Okay, thank you. So where we are at is that there's a motion on the floor to recommend to the council to adopt the FY23 budget as recommended by the town manager. We have had no motions to amend that, and either to an amendment could be to reduce any section of budget or to increase in the one area that's permitted by state law. So I'm going to just keep an eye now really closely for hands going up. If there is no motion to amend, then we're going to move to a vote on the motion that's on the floor. And I see none, so therefore I think we're at the point of voting for the motion on the floor, and I am going to pick in the middle and then just go alphabetically in order, but start with Michelle.
Yes.
Kathy?
Yes.
I'm a yes. Alicia?
Yes.
Lynn?
Whoops. Yes.
Bob?
Sorry, support.
Matt?
Yes.
So you're supporting, and Bernie.
Support.
Okay, so the motion has been passed unanimously with support indicated from all resident members, and I think we've done a lot of good discussion that will be, I'm going to work hard in the method that's described. I will submit a report within the next, by tomorrow to the council that states the motion and explains a little bit about our process, and a further report and explanation will be coming. And I will work on the draft and get the draft to the committee. It will only be going to the committee, not to counselors and other counselors, so that nobody expects it who's not a member of the committee. And I will welcome any comments received, as I do in all of the reports. Lynn.
Do we have all sections covered? And the other thing I need to do is adjourn the council, because we now only have 6 counselors in the room. So the council's adjourned at 11:48. And so I go back to my question, do we have all the sections of the budget draft covered? And if not, what else needs to get done and by whom? And when do you want absolutely want our drafts? Thank you. Michelle's green.
Yeah. At this point, I think that I just need to do it by email, because I don't want to put anybody on the spot during the meeting itself. But I will try and move address that question in an email. And I think that's probably the fairest way to do it. I need to take a break for just a second. I'm going to ask Kathy as vice chair, just if you are able to just go for a moment and start the discussion as to when we can next meet. Because I think everybody knows what the date problem is, and I'll be right.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. What I think was the June 7th date did not work. The morning time didn't work. So what I don't know is whether Andy sent out alternatives for a different time, either later on. So Alicia, was it you that the June 7th date didn't work for?
Yeah, I can't do the morning time. I can do after 3, like I could do like a 3 to 5 meeting that day, but otherwise I would have to do a different day.
So let me ask what was on, so that is next month. So let me ask, on my calendar, that's fine. So what does 3 to 5 on June 7th look like for, let me see, what should I do? Should I say, raise a hand if you can't do it? Or you can, if everyone raises a hand, if they can do it? I think, yes, I think we gotta, okay, I'll tell Andy, we just found June 7th.
Andy is back and his hand is not up.
Yeah, because I'm not sure what's being asked.
Okay,
No, I haven't
so
either.
June 7th, 3 to 5, Alyssa can make it. And it looked to me like everyone said that time and day. So it's keeping it on Tuesday, the 7th. But
It's a definite maybe for me. I don't, the morning meeting would have worked. The afternoon meeting is iffy, but I'm not a vote. So let's go forward and schedule your meeting. And if I can make it in, I'll make it in.
So Michelle, is your hand still up on it didn't work for you, or?
Well, just selfishly, given that we'll be discussing reparations, I'd love for everybody to be able to be there. But I also had something on my calendar, and I don't know if this is a council thing, Mass Safe. Is that anything, Lynn, ringing a bell to you? It's 2 to 3, but which wouldn't really, but I don't know what it is. So I'm just, is that,
No, it's
okay.
not.
I have no clue what it is. Sometimes that happens.
When you figure it out, let us know.
Yeah. So, I mean, 3 to 5 is fine for me, but again, would love for the most participation.
But it looks like there's one person who's iffy, Bernie, and everyone else said yes. Is that correct? Okay.
Yeah.
So Andy,
And
that's what
Okay.
I did. That's what I did while you were going for your 30 seconds. So,
Yeah, thank you. No, appreciate it. And that solves that problem. Then,
Hey, this is sorry to interrupt. Paul and I might have a library building committee meeting on that day. So if we do, we would just have to leave a little early. I don't think we have one this week, Paul. So normally that would mean we would have one next Tuesday at 4:30.
Yeah,
so,
we do have a library building committee meeting at 4:30 on the 7th.
So if it's 3 to 5, just we would have to try to get through the things that would require us to be there. Which is fine. I think we probably can.
okay, so the agenda is going to be basically, I think, unless there's a large amount of questions or comments, it's all about capital improvement program and the reparations discussion. At least we need to get as far as being able to respond something to the in the first report on that issue. So were there other issues? Oh,
We
you
may
had
also,
something else.
yeah, we also may have Centennial because of being accepted into the state revolving fund program. We have to make sure we have funding for the entire project in place. So that would be another agenda item.
So it's capital, reparations, and centennial.
And with capital, we've already discussed that with the finance committee at 2 separate meetings. So that one, I imagine, it'll depend on what comes up at the forum. But that one may be
Yeah, exactly. And we're just holding off voting on the capital as a recommendation to the council till after the forum. But the vote at the council will be the same night as the budget vote, which is the 13th.
Right.
That's why we were trying for the 7th for meetings, so that it would have a natural flow to it. And then because we're desiring to have only one meeting during the month of June, we wanted to get reparations and other issues like Centennial into the same meeting. Michelle, your hand's up.
Yes. There are members of the AHRA that would like to contribute to the discussion, Andy, and I was going to speak to you about this offline, but how do you recommend that would happen? Do I have to call a meeting of the AHRA to be here during that portion of the discussion? Or, I mean, I know it gets kind of, I don't like when people are getting brought in and brought out. So I'm looking to Lynn and to Andy about that. So I make sure I post that appropriately.
If you have a quorum that's going to be there for the discussion, you should post it joint with the finance committee. We can bring them in for that portion of the meeting, and then you can adjourn them and we'll go on.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, so is there anything else? Because the other thing that I'm getting a little bit concerned about, but I'll talk with Athena about this, a separate discussion offline, is we need to move forward with minutes. So I think we're getting a stack of minutes backed up. Are there other issues that people would like to raise? I'm just going to look at hands, and that includes whether Paul or Sean have anything you'd like to address to the committee at this point. So otherwise, I think we're ready to adjourn. And seeing no hands coming up, I guess at that point, then we are ready to adjourn. And I do adjourn the committee, and thank you all. And it's been a very good discussion. And thank you, Paul, and thank you.